Oh wait, are all of our numbers accessible to everyone?
No, it went right to the host.
Okay.
So hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Soft Topics. It's a series of events on the power of craft to subvert and persevere in times of crisis. This series is a co-presentation with the Art Gallery of Burlington and Studio Magazine in Craft, Ontario. I'm Suzanne Cart. I'm the senior curator at the Art Gallery of Burlington. I'm a middle-aged white woman. I have short brown hair, heavily streaked with gray. I'm wearing a black and white shirt with a pair of big brass earrings and bright pink lipstick. I'm in my white walled apartment and a very large plant beside me here. So it's great to virtually connect with everyone across Turtle Island today, and with you folks from this virtual stage in Toronto, the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. The AGB, where I work and play, is located on Lake Ontario, the land upon which is the ancient Dish with One Spoon Treaty and the Brant Tract Purchase Treaty number 3 3/4. We're grateful to the Mississaugas of the Credit and their Six Nations of Grand River for sharing and caring for this territory with us. So AGB's curatorial assistant, Jasmine Mander, is going to be joining us tonight. She'll be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A function. So if you have any questions, please type them to everyone or to an AGB staff member who will pass them on to the presenters. So we'll make every effort tonight to address as many questions as possible, but it might not happen. But we do gladly take them into consideration and account for future programming. So you can select at the very bottom is the closed caption for the Zoom window. Also in the chat is the AGB's code of conduct, which applies to this space. And the AGB is a public art gallery. We're devoted to supporting contemporary art, craft, and related thought. It's the home and partner of Arts Burlington, which is an organization which represents 6 guilds. And the ecology of our studio space is an open network of artists and makers at all levels. Over the last 40 years, or 45 years now almost, the AGB has amassed the largest comprehensive collection of Canadian ceramics in the world, totaling over 4,000 works. We boast a broad selection of work across the country, ranging from highly functional to sculptural installations that illustrate the intersection of high craftsmanship and artistic expression. We support the study and the preservation of contemporary Canadian ceramics and the circulation of clay production in current social movements and contexts. So the hope for the Soft Topics conversations is to engage our audiences in critical debate. It's around the time of our All Guild Show, an exhibition that celebrates the guilds who make, learn, share, and teach at the AGB, which includes the Fine Arts Association, the Hand Weavers and Spinners Guild, Latau Photographers Guild, the Potters Guild, the Hook and Craft Guild, the Sculptors and Carvers, and also our newest addition to the team, which is the Digital Arts Guild. So we're using this opportunity to connect our peers working in and with contemporary craft institutions, associations, and cultural centers, as well as curators, artists, and academics who are drawing threads from craft and contemporary art practices to think through our current social and political climate, to initiate conversations with our memberships, the guilds, and the greater craft and digital communities. So pairing this annual exhibition with the Soft Topics series strives to facilitate an intersectoral, intergenerational dialogue on exploratory practices and artist-led pedagogies, while contextualizing the significant history of craft at the gallery and introducing new audiences to traditions of material fluency and application. So I'm new to the world of craft, and I use these opportunities to learn very publicly from these strong voices within arts education and production discourse. I'm grateful to them and to the Arts Guilds of Burlington for their generosity in sharing ideas and skills so freely, and I'm appreciative of their continued good humor and patience in doing so. So today's discussion is What's Craft Got to Do with It? It discusses the increased representation of craft in the expanded field by contemporary artists. We're joined by an inspirational panel of artists and curators, Nicole Burish, Swapna Tamne, Linda Sorman, and Nadia Mir to exchange ideas around the potential and the pitfalls of material agency and provide a narrative on how the implication and explosion of craft in contemporary public art galleries has led to an exciting possibilities for collaboration and co-evolution. But along with that comes the consequences of appropriation, of co-option, and further marginalization of craft in traditional art forms. While it's energizing to see material engagement taking place in space in larger institutions, craft artists and makers, along with tradition and ancestral knowledge production, remains excluded from these systems of representation. As material wonderment of craft is exalted, the history of production, cultural sensitivities, functional forms, and high-level technique are often not acknowledged. So I want to say that the bios for all of the presenters are also in the chat, but I will allow each one of them to introduce themselves through their practice and their experience of working between craft and contemporary art. Then we're going to open it up to discussion and questions. So we will start now with Nicole.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having us, Suzanne, and thanks to the AGB and Jasmine for your support in putting this talk on. A quick note, I've had to run over very quickly to a friend's house because there was a power outage at mine, so you'll forgive me if it's might be a little bit of noise or things going on in the background here. I am tuning in today from Jaujague, Montreal, and where I live and work as an uninvited guest on lands stewarded traditionally by the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I work as a critic and curator, and I'm currently working as the director of the FOFA Gallery at Concordia University. For my little introduction here, I've got more of a prepared kind of talk, but first I wanted to say how thrilled I am to be on this panel with these three artists that I so admire. It's a real honor to be here with all of you. You're certainly all people who have shaped very much my thinking around these topics. So it's very exciting to me that we get to talk here together today. The goal here is for me to talk for about 8 to 10 minutes. So like I said, I think they're going to warn me if I go over, but I've got a sort of more prepared little presentation. When Suzanne first approached me with initial ideas for this panel, I returned to a text that I wrote in 2015 about the exhibition Making Otherwise, which was curated by Heather Anderson for the Carleton University Art Gallery and featured works by Richard Boulay, Ursula Johnson, Marc Coultemanche, Paul Mathieu, Sarah Maloney, and Janet Morton. I'm going to reread through some passages from that text now, as I think they still hold a lot of the thinking and questions that are continuing to shape how I think about this topic of craft and contemporary art today. So that text took as its starting point a 2014 review by critic Sarah Archer called "The Meaning of Clay at the Whitney Biennial." And in this article, she specifically addresses the ceramic work of artists Sterling Ruby and John Mason, and more broadly, the inclusion of craft in the section of the 2014 Whitney Biennial curated by Michelle Grabner. The article was remarkable to me, and to me still remains remarkable because it accounts not only for this kind of contemporary art side of things, but also accounts for the perspectives of those in the craft world. And she kind of adeptly describes why those kinds of curatorial choices might not always kind of sit easy or find appreciation from artists, ceramic artists, or those kind of within the traditional craft establishment, and describes how the people from that world may tend to perceive the inclusion of craft in that kind of exhibition as almost a kind of threat to their longstanding efforts to have craft maybe recognized within fine art. I sort of just thought about this as, after years of fighting for inclusion, there's this understandable sting for the craft community when contemporary artists are gaining acclaim for using, or we might even say appropriating, the materials and processes that have been the purview of craft all along. Archer also kind of talks about this sort of overwhelming bias of craft history, one that's focused on skilled making. And she notes that, quotes, all of this history can weigh heavily on a person. It can make the sight of cavalier treatment of any traditional material, clay in particular, feel offensive, even painful, as though centuries of cultural memory were being cruelly cast aside and forgotten. The end of that quote. So these anxieties about the contemporary treatment of craft materials are not completely unfounded. And it's important to recognize that this notion of sort of a cavalier treatment relates not only to applications of skill, and we might think about that sort of in works like Sterling Ruby's, which deploy this seemingly sloppy approach to craft. There's a lot of writing about that approach. But also we might extend that kind of that sort of problematic around cavalier treatment also to thinking about craft's historical position. When we follow the legacies of like lots of contemporary artists, like Kelly, Tracy Emin, Grayson Perry are ones that come to mind. And we could also think about the kind of prevalence and permeability of this highly problematic category of outsider art, and watching how much those sorts of things have appeared in contemporary art. We see that much of the appeal of craft materials and those practices continues to stem from the historical associations with craft's marginalized position. This connection is frequently emphasized by this kind of underskilled or de-skilled approach to materials. The critic Garth Clark has described this as the "look ma, I just found ceramics" moment in the fine arts. Clark notes also that rather than representing a victory for crafts, these inclusions are, he describes this as the result of the liberalizing impact of postmodernism and its promiscuous approach to means and matter. And I would add, these things can tend to reinforce rather than challenge traditional insider-outsider or high-low binaries. At its worst, some of these sort of ahistorical or tokenistic uses of craft materials can approach a form of appropriation and may gloss over the practices and voices of the women, people of color, Black and Indigenous communities, whose historical exclusion from fine art canons or discourses has often hinged on dismissal of their work as craft. So like Archer, I want to acknowledge these kind of like complicated stakes and mistakes around the so-called cavalier treatment of materials, while at the same time recognizing, on the other hand, that there might be something to gain from practices and readings that engage deeply, differently, or irreverently with the matters and potentials of a given material. I argued in that text for the need to understand what I termed the historical material baggage of craft, where we might think about the properties and agency of the material itself, but also of its historical use and positioning. And this is very much inspired by my own training in a very technically focused ceramics program. I did a BFA at ACAD, now AU Arts, and that was following a 3-year, very intensive after-school ceramics program. I was a giant dork in high school. So in that training, I inherited what sometimes now seems to me like a very conservative view of what good ceramics are. And I can still get my back up when I see a badly glazed or lopsided pot at a craft sale. So I still hold some of this training in me. At the same time, I am totally delighted and inspired by works like those of the artists on the panel that engage so sensitively or playfully or intelligently with some of crafts, that historical material baggage that I'm talking about. So this is all to say I am as much full of contradictions as anyone else when it comes to this debate, and kind of sit on, or it's not a debate, but sit on both sides of the that kind of art craft divide. And to wrap up, if I have another minute here, I wanted to share a quick list as I was preparing for this talk of real life examples that either struck me as surprising or strange or relevant to what we're talking about, kind of mini case studies, if you will. So the first one, a painting student has started working with ceramics and they're achieving these gorgeous textural surfaces through experiments with glaze. They are thrilled when I tell them about John Chalk, a Governor Award-winning ceramic artist who this student had never heard of before. And why would they? Example number 2, a major international commercial art fair includes a special section of woven and textile art. All the artists are women and all are from the global south. Case number 3, a prominent Canadian gallerist is kind of miffed when I expressed interest in one of her artists saying that it was because of my background in crafts. For her, this artist was not someone working in crafts, despite the fact that they work primarily in textiles. One of my fantastic summer interns who minors in art history was really excited the other day to learn about contemporary Indigenous artists like Nico Williams, who work with beadworking, noting that she had never seen beadwork in any of her courses. My good friend, the one whose house I am actually crashing right now, texted me from Venice this spring with the message, quote, "I am at the Biennale and it's very crafty in here," before flooding my phone with pictures of garish ceramic tiles and woven everything. And that's not a bad thing. So that's another, just to pinpoint that other example. So maybe I'll stop there. I want to just kind of sketch out this range of kind of contradictory ways that craft is or is not valued in contemporary art, sometimes for very different reasons. So that's about it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And Swapna, you're up next.
Hi, just going to share my screen. Hi, so thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And thank you, Nicole, Nadia, and Linda. I'm so pleased to be in dialogue with you and your work and your research. I've titled this talk a loose translation that is of the hand. So Hatachi, which is from Marathi, the language I speak, or Hatkakam, Hindi, of the hand or handwork. And just thinking about craft in relation to the hand. So I recently attended an online symposium on design in India, and the former executive director of the National Institute of Design, Professor Ashok Chatterjee, said something that really struck me. He said that Gandhi was a designer to his fingertips. And here, Professor Chatterjee considers design within India as seva or service. But craft and design and art in India are driven by caste and caste hierarchies within the Hindu religious system. And you can see here, there's Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. So in the lower castes, who are the backbone of the economy, actually, and historically served all castes. Here you can see there's ironsmiths, bronze worker, goldsmiths, artists, seashell artisans, potters. So they're of the lowest caste, but they're not the Ati Shudras who fall out of caste. In India by Design, by Saloni Mathur, who is an anthropologist and art historian, she discusses the role of craft and the representation of a craftsman that Gandhi adopts. So I found this really interesting, that at the heart of the Swadeshi movement, which I'll speak about in a second, he presents himself as a spinner and as a weaver. And we have this very iconic image. I'll just return back to that, where he would, this is a photograph by Margaret Burke-White, where he is sitting and spinning khadi at his ashram in Ahmedabad. So craft becomes the heart of the anti-colonial movement, the nationalist movement, through the Swadeshi or self-reliance movement that was begun by Gandhi and centered on making one's own clothes. Even though, so he is presenting himself as a craftsperson, even though he's trained as a lawyer at University College London. Cotton has been cultivated since 5000 before Common Era and is connected to colonialism and slavery, and was exported by the East India Company beginning in the mid-1660s. India is the largest producer of cotton today and the second largest exporter, with a cotton seed that is laboratory altered by Monsanto. So here, khadi, hand-spun handloom cotton, is used as a key part of the movement towards independence from colonial rule by resisting the purchase of imported cloth and foreign goods from the British, who were taking raw cotton from India, producing it in mills in Manchester and Lancashire, and then selling it back to the Indians. Prior to the uninvited arrival of the British, Dutch, or Portuguese, India held 27% of the world's economy and textile export. Towards the tail end of colonial rule, India had less than -2%. The first mill was allowed to be opened under the British rule in 1854 in Bombay or Mumbai, and then was followed by Ahmedabad, which is a city of a key source of my research for the current exhibition that's on at the ROM. So while I'm critical of Gandhi for some of his views, I'm a little ambivalent, I'm still fascinated by his own embodiment as a craftsman in the formation of branding a resistance against colonialism. And in that way, craft is then used as a political ideology. And khadi is then a material that represents a decolonial process and carries, for me, an inherent form of resistance. So it was drawing that led me to making handmade paper, initially as a way to create my own surfaces or my own structures for drawing. In questioning where I could situate my body as one from the South Asian diaspora, settler colonial, and from a geography that continues to inform me, it became crucial to make my own foundation and substrate instead of simply buying ready-made paper. Khadi became a starting point for thinking about my artistic practice, which is centered on drawing, politics of materiality, and the presence of the hand and the handmade. And it becomes an index for me, that is drawing, as a way to build a methodology for decolonizing a relationship of image making and how to bridge art, craft, and design, which in India were separated by Victorian ideals of high and low art. And drawing, for instance, was introduced as a technical skill in the mid 1800s in both Britain and in schools established in India. So my hand is involved in every part of the process. This is dispersing pulp. And I'm interested in how my hand is adding to the palimpsest of previous hands that made the fabric to begin with. So from cutting up the cloth into small squares and then consistently checking it during the hours when it is beaten in the process of making. So there are several points that I'm kind of thinking about here. The role of the craftsperson, their role in economy and society, and then from a macro view, how craft was adopted as a political ideology and how the material of cotton was part of the decolonial process. With all that in mind, some of the questions that arise for me when we engage crafts and what does it mean to also work with craftspersons, particularly in India, and what do words like tradition, traditional, authentic, preserve, knowledge, and knowledge transfer mean in the contemporary landscapes when they're working they're working today. They're not working 5,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago or even 100 years ago. They're working today. In the exhibition Mobile Palace, which is at the ROM until August 1st, the work really began with wanting to encounter the hand and the work of the hand through the skills of woodblock carving and block printing. I was interested in how a repeated image could still reveal itself as being of the hand. I was also interested in where the expertise of the carver and the block printer would appear or how it would appear and what skill sharing could be. So I've been working with an NGO called CAMIR, which stands for Kutch Heritage, Art, Music, Information, and Resources. And it also means intrinsic pride in Kutchi. So that's the language, that's the little red area. You can see it's very close to the border of what is now Pakistan. And it was established in 2005 to revitalize and strengthen the crafts and artisans of the Kutch district in India. So this is an area that suffered a massive earthquake in 2001. So part of a lot of their kind of industry is set around, creating products that are direct to consumer. Because they're so dedicated to revitalizing crafts, they have been focused on certain block printing methods and motifs like adrak, bandhani, camel wool, metal smithing. And I was surprised they're willing to work with me because my motifs are, this is adrak printing, and my motifs are quite different. So in a sense, I had a lot of no's at the beginning for certain parts of this project, but they also were willing to work with me and kind of speak about collaboration as well. So I'm just going to run through some images very quickly. So I have about 2 minutes left. This is just, I wanted to share this beautiful, beautiful animal with you. This is from the environment of Kutch. And this is my first trip in 2018 when I really didn't know where I was going or what I was doing, but beginning to work with Saleh Mahmoud Khatri, the block printer and dyer. This is Mukesh Bhai, Prajapati, the block carver. And this is, I won't go into this, but this is the building that the blocks are based on, and some sample tests. And then in that process of collaboration, I really wanted them to see the building that I was referring to. So we made a trip from Bhuj to Ahmedabad, which is about 5 hours of a drive, and to really speak about this space and to speak about transferring something that's three-dimensional into a two-dimensional surface. And to play with kind of skipping blocks. And in the exhibition, the curator, the Pali Dewan, has presented us all as artists in this way, and she's titled this section "Collaboration as Resistance." So thinking about how to actually resist these hierarchies between art, craft, and design that are determined through 300 years of colonial rule. And then I just wanted to include this image. When I received all the material back, I felt like my hand was really out of the process. So I spent a lot of time doing this kind of applique work. And then I just wanted to share a few objects that I really love and that are always kind of sitting in the back of my mind that are that move anywhere from like sort of fine art to everyday objects to folk art. And this is a cane basket, Kofi basket from Nagaland, which is really beautiful in its construction. These are vessels that are used to ask for alms. Like, so this is a very particular sect of the Jain religion, and each evening they go around to different homes and they, whatever they get in their bowls, what they will cook or eat. So each person from the sect is given a set of these amazing wooden bowls, and they're incredibly thin and beautifully carved, hand carved. And then Nicole, what you were speaking about in terms of outsider art, it's very interesting because the Indie Art Fair, as of this last session, is now beginning to include a lot of folk art. And I saw this amazing exhibition in 2010 that has like really influenced my thinking. And a lot of these pieces were commissioned. So a lot of contemporary craftspersons were commissioned to make these works. And I just want to end, and then these beautiful leather puppets, I won't go into it. And I just want to end with this lovely little object by a contemporary designer who works under the name Deepoy, which means 3 legs. And Spandana Gopal works with metal spinners. And this is a little milk pour that has a lip that's a little bit longer on one side. And in all of the utensils and pots that you see in India in the steel patela, the steel pots, they all have a lip that prevent a drip. And it's a very beautiful little innovation. And so she's only included that lip on one side. And it's just one of my favorite objects. It's a really simple, but really brilliant design that I think, really weds this idea of design and craft and the everyday into one object. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Swapna. I'll move to Nadia.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Suzanne. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you. My conversation is very, very informal. So I put together some images of past works, and I think I'll speak to them to share my screen. Let's try this. So I don't really consider myself a craft person. I never have. And I've never really made the distinction in my practice between high art or craft, but I know it's important to a lot of people. And maybe one of the reasons why is I think, and this is maybe something that Swapna was saying, and something that you had also said, Nicole, about kind of like situating the practice within something that made sense to me as an Indigenous person. These aren't my works. This is just kind of some background interest of, you know, what I was looking at as a way to connect my identity as an Indigenous person to, you know, what I was seeing in the world. And I think maybe this is like the inside of a book, this Indian Arts and Crafts book. I have a feeling, I have a strong feeling that I kind of grew up with this book, but I can't tell for sure. And again, these are some works that I saw at Pitt Rivers in the UK of wampum. And so for me, the first part was really kind of like learning how to build things in an ancestral way, and, you know, learning how to work with materials in the way that, you know, my Algonquin, you know, grandmothers and grandfathers would have done. And having not grown up in community, a lot of the work was, you know, figuring out how to meet people and how to learn from people and share, have them share with me. So one of the first works I make in this is this piece called History in Two Parts, which is a half aluminum and half birch bark canoe. And it was Pinook Smith who kind of showed me how to, you know, split logs, shape the wood, and kind of assemble. And I don't know if it's well made, but it's well enough made that it can float on the water, and that becomes its own work. And at the same time, I think what I was really kind of thinking about, and probably am still thinking about over 20 years later, is points of connection, and points of connection between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And in one way, that's kind of where the wampum comes in, as you know, original contracts and as kind of systems of understanding between peoples, basically. And so that to me becomes kind of a visual language, and the language of beading becomes really important in my practice as I make my own wampum, but as I also kind of think about the power structures of the Indian Act and what that means to Indigenous people, and then kind of a reaction of wanting to bead over it and realizing that the challenge was maybe too big for me to do alone at that time. And, you know, in the beginning, I was doing it all alone. And then somebody was like, well, I'd really like to help you with that because it's also important to me. And so I worked with Rhonda Meyer to get, you know, over 250 people to bead over the Indian Act with me. So yeah, very crafty. But I think in this case, you know, this idea of, and I didn't really know how to bead, so I had to kind of learn that. This idea of kind of taking something and reworking it and turning it into, you know, a language, and also the craftiness of the idea maybe is maybe more important than kind of like whether I beaded it really, really well. And because it was a collaborative piece at the end, you know, with all sorts of hands having touched this work, you know, in the beginning, I would undo everybody's work and then try and make it better. And near, you know, after doing that enough times, I, you know, learned to kind of let it go and be easy in the energy that was unique to each of the pieces. And I kind of continue this in the SCAR project, which is another kind of long-term participatory work where I invite over 1,400 people to sew a representation of a scar that they carry, and then write the story of that scar. And, you know, again, so the fine art moment is, you know, maybe the crafting of the criteria and then the piecing of each of the scars together to kind of create this whole, or this, you know, unity, right? And then at the same time, looking at those scars and pulling out kind of most common, I don't know, signs, most common emblems, beating them, and then transforming those into large photography. And thinking about that process in an even larger scale. So how might it function as public art, or how might it function as, you know, not signage, but something else. And at the same time, I think the handmade gesture, you know, the thing that Swapna is talking about, this slow meditative moment of being invested in what you're doing, right, is also a certain quality. But I mean, to be an artist, right? One of the things that I find really incredible about this conversation is that some people will have more of a mastery in the making, and other people will have more of a mastery in the ideas. And somehow in between there, you know, there's kind of high art and, or art, I don't know what you want to call it. And, you know, sometimes it's open enough. I don't know. Let's discuss. I don't know how much time I have left, but this was another project, you know, going back to this idea of connection. And so in this moment, what I was looking at was how Indian crafts were being sold to non-Indigenous women back in the Victorian days, of, you know, instructions about how to make native crafts as a kind of fun consumable, I guess. And so I created an installation where, you know, I listened to a bunch of audio recordings about how to make certain things and tried to make them not knowing what I was making. I don't know if this will play. Let me see. Oh, yeah, it does. So I recorded, you know, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of making. And the challenge was to see if I could make what was being referenced, but I didn't have pictures and I didn't have titles, and all of the information about what I was making was given to me blind. So I was trying to test this theory about, you know, deep knowledge, or knowledge that you might carry in the blood. But at the same time, what's beautiful about this video is sometimes the hands aren't doing anything. They're just thinking, you know, and they're quiet. And so that's an element of craft, I think, of where do I go next? What am I supposed to do? How does this really work? You know, you're trying to discover as you're building, basically. Some installation shots of that exhibition, and some transformations of the, you know, the, I don't know what that was. It was a canoe basket. And then, but yeah, a very, that's very interesting, because my impulse was, okay, I can display this canoe basket, which is, you know, crocheted, and I didn't know how to crochet, so I had to learn how to crochet to do it. But then my impulse was to photograph it in such a way to create a large digital print of it to kind of like oversize. So, because I guess I'm not all about the craft. This was me in London, finding a whole bunch of kind of shards, ceramic shards, and they had holes in them. I thought they were beads, but they were actually pipe stems. So I beaded them as if they were beads. And, you know, it kind of speaks really clearly to the material culture of, you know, of my people. This is wampum that I saw while I was in Pitt Rivers. But then also using those ideas of the shards, of the little pieces of many, to kind of, you know, create other things that really don't make sense, like baskets. out of ceramics or public art, tree skins that are just kind of woven. I'm almost at the end, just showing you pictures because I'm really excited, to be working in ceramics. I'm not a ceramicist, so we could talk about that. Actually, my hands haven't touched ceramics in over 25 years. But I do like the pieces, and I like having the control of kind of weaving them together and to thinking about hand making these pieces that I can weave. So that's my presentation. How do I get out of here?
Thank you. Linda?
Hi everyone, I'm Linda Sorman, and I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples here in the basement of my parents' home. And so when we were talking about that weight of history, that historical material baggage of craft, but also just the familial weight, I kind of feel that in the architectural setting in this moment. And I'm really, really pleased to be joining this conversation. Thank you for inviting me, Suzanne. I'll share my screen. I recently learned this year that my last name, Sorman, is not just the Indonesian meaning of reflection or mirror, as it is in Indonesian, which is, I think, the job of artists and makers to reflect realities and culture and lived experience. But Finnish friends have reached out to me to let me know that it also means to make with the fingers. So for over 20 years, I didn't know this at all, and I'm really interested in how languages from different places and different sources inform and shape the motivations that we believe that we have when we're working with this material. When I'm making in this linear drawing kind of setting, and drawing from my first introduction to making, which was through painting. I was a painting emphasis, not a ceramic oriented person. And, at the beginning of learning all of these craft processes and art processes, it was important to name what you were. I was, really confronted with the dismay of my professors when I decided to move from architecture and then into painting. And when I moved from painting to ceramics, there was, faculty outcry. And that idea that you'd be wasting your time in a medium was very live at the time, and hopefully not something we have to discuss today, but it's part of my history. This is an image from Thailand, Bangkok, Thailand. It's a Buddhist temple in the middle of Bangkok, from the royal temple. And part of the renovation and the renewal of the cultural center is to replace ceramic tiles from the roofs. So these are earthenware, lead glazed tiles, and this is bamboo scaffolding. The structures that have a way of being contingent on other structures are very interesting to me. So not only what we're supposed to be looking at, but the structures that support those structures. And those scaffoldings, those lattice work structures find their way in my work, but I'm pinching them, I'm making them through the movements of a hand pressing against wet material. I also gather stories from objects that are found in thrift shops. People give them to me from their family collections. So this is a kitsch lamb and some pottery that's found at a thrift shop that found its way into never whole. I'm interested also in the idea of things never being whole, that ceramics can reflect that aspect of things happening in parts or being only seen or understood in fragments. Fragments being something that come together in clay, and this is the structure of clay. And, learning this much later than when I first touched the material and seeing that scaffolding grow, I think influenced the way that I use clay as an interstitial tissue, a way of combining sentences or phrases or dialects. Going along with that idea of ceramics and clay as language, the language has dialects in it. So feeling and hearing the rhythms of what it means to pinch something, what it means to have slabs in something, a wall, something that's holding something, containing something, or allowing porosity, allowing things to flow through a space in a ceramic context. This is an installation from Coda 1 Permanenten in Norway, in Bergen, Norway. And Are You Land or Water is an installation that used clay to open up a space and allow people to walk towards the installation and closer to these Buddha sculptures. These were from the Song, Sui, and Tang dynasty and brought to Norway by General Munte, a Norwegian general who lived in China for 50 years. So that idea of appropriating objects, taking them from one place and having them then situated against this yellow wall for years. And I would watch, for the 3 days that I observed the space, people kind of just walking by. And I really wanted people to come closer and to enact this kind of embodied interaction and invitation to conversation that was very physical. And I wanted the proximity of people coming into the space to be much more intimate. And so drawing close to the objects in the wooden trash and the ceramic forms that started to roll through the space like water, I hoped would draw people into that in a physical way. How clay and other materials bring us beyond language and ask us to deepen our experience in a nonverbal way, in this way that can maybe have the heartbeat of the process and the understanding of our lived somatic experience, our physical experience, our sensorial experience. That's what's drawn me to this material. This is from last summer, and making a piece on my hands and knees for a couple of months and asking the lines of the clay to move through and in between and underneath, and then covering it every day, and kind of that slowness that happens in the craft practice, having that really slow process of coaxing the moisture away by putting newspaper, crumpled up newspaper all over this, covering it with a sheet of plastic all over, and then spraying the outside of the plastic, and then coming back the next day, taking out the moist pieces of paper, having that process in contrast to many of the digital processes that we are exploring in the 21st century. So this is a 3D printed model of the same object. How can we go back and forth between technology and hands-on exploration to ask questions? I think a lot of my work lives in this place of asking questions. And in this work, this for me reflected Tatlin's Tower, and that reflected, modernism, but also the Tower of Babel, the place where all languages sprang from, and also this confusion of language that happened when people dared to reach beyond what they were meant to have and meant to understand. And so that kind of unraveling of language, if a craft language is supposed to pull things together and hold things in meaning and in community, I'm interested in processes that also unravel those places of logic and understanding. This is another scan of Flight Risk, another piece that I wanted to see what it would look like in digital space, and having that then contrasted with being in physical space with Juliana Chaniago, who's teaching me silat, martial art, kind of movement, but also eye contact that happens. For this martial art to happen in Indonesia, you must look at your opponent with the eyes of a lion. So having that kind of physical contact and that closeness and intimacy in contrast with digital space is something that I go back and forth, and I think we all negotiate those spaces in our everyday lives as we go back and forth between technologies. This is Spenkiet Ga Kun Karen Carnes, and making it in the outdoor space and allowing the gold leaf and allowing the stories of Karen Carnes to be part of the inspiration. Karen Carnes was a potter and made these amazing vessels, and some of them had split feet in them. And so she would slice up the middle and have this kind of severing and this, bifurcation of a form, opening it up in two parts. So this thing that violated what was supposed to be a whole vessel. That idea, that's a very kind of classic understanding of the ceramic pot or the vessel, something that contains things and is well behaved and is a cultural solidity, something you could depend on, is something that I wanted to poke at in these forms. This is Reshaping Rage, When Revenge Makes Perfect Sense, and the title's taken from a quote by Judith Butler in an interview she gave in the New Yorker. And she talks about how people in the world have every reason to be in a state of total rage, and what we do together with that rage is important. So the things that we can't say, things that enrage us, things that fill our body with a certain sensation, are are the things that I'm hoping to put into these sculptures. When language fails me, when logic and when things don't make any sense, I go to my work and have this place for things to be in a nonverbal realm. Rage can be crafted. It's sort of an art form of politics, and having these forms not just in a formal way, but also knowing that you can't even see behind to the next level. Some of the things are uttered in places that can't be accessed later. So there's a secrecy and something that is lost in the process that I'm interested in sharing. The hand is also, all through my process, and having video as part of this new installation stream at Mass MoCA, which is open until April 2nd next year. I want that sense of the hand to be also with this idea of things happening in virtual space, in virtual reality. So having some of the video coming from footage that is shot in spaces of fun digital apps that are distorting the human figure, but also animating clay and having things move in ways that are new and unfamiliar and uncomfortable to me. This friction between what is kind of the traditional understanding of what I should feel when I encounter ceramics. Maybe I should feel comforted and safe and contained by a form, can be then upturned and turned inside out in an installation like this one. For me, this has this way of turning stories inside out, as well as the way that materials are supposed to behave, which then opens up options for me to behave in ways that maybe I wasn't supposed to be so comfortable in behaving. So having that underside, the underbelly of sculptures that are made in one piece on a kiln bed, and then when they're hoisted in the air, then show their kind of disconcerted state, this unscripted underbelly, and maybe the things that you aren't supposed to see are then revealed when the piece is turned up in space in this way. That sense of things being ungrounded and hoping to tell stories that maybe reach towards the celestial, also then go right down into the ground, and how there is this kind of rootedness in local clay that's happening. So when I was in Indonesia in 2014, I really started searching back towards my roots. My father's family is from Indonesia, from North Sumatra. And, in Alfred, where I was teaching with Keith Simpson, we'd go and be right there looking at the 20,000 times magnified clay, but also, hitting the clay onto rocks and using this approach to understand that, these materials come from place, from literal place. And I'm just going to speed through to the end because we have about 2 minutes left. But in this Batak Toba village, I wanted to find some kind of link to my family's past, and this kind of contemporary lostness that I think a lot of us feel, that I definitely experience. I think that's one reason I go back to craft, is looking for that inheritance and that sense of, what happens in a place where Mr. Pranoto is making bricks for the homes in that village, and allowing me to put sculptures in the middle of that kiln, and then have industry and design and architecture come side by side with craft and art practice. And I just want to speed to the end here. I just wanted to share some of the newest discoveries that have happened. So during the pandemic, I was making these 25-foot paintings, painting on both sides, kind of just intuitively doing it, not knowing that, I was cutting them up, putting them as sculptures. I didn't know that there was this whole tradition of 17-meter books that were made from pounded bark in my Batak Indonesian culture. My great-great-grandfather was a shaman, and he would have used these books as ways to hold the information for spells and for ways of healing. And these long pieces of written text were in these books that I only encountered this past February in the UK. And looking at the pictograms in these books, which I only just discovered, and then looking at the figures that are embedded into my sculptures, I started to really see this resonance that I wasn't expecting. Things like this rooster kept coming up. These are all kind of a secret language that I can't read, and I need to find help in deepening the research for this. This is all at the British Library. But this rooster form, 2 years before that, the rooster form was finding its way into the bottom of my pieces here. So this idea of things being understood through fragments, not whole, is also kind of echoed through this Batak Toba piece. This is my culture And there was always this use of found trade ceramics, things that they didn't make, but they found blue and white Chinese pots and then would make their own handmade accessories and things that would partner with the objects. And that's also something that I only discovered this past year.
Thank you, everyone, for that. I'll start off the question. Of course, like I have so many from each one of your presentations. And then I always have that moment where I think, why the binary? Why this delineation between craft and contemporary art? But I also know that that is a conversation that is long standing and is also very interesting to me and new to me right now, but I know it's been something that's been that's been going on for a very long time. And that now that I'm in galleries and seeing larger exhibitions that are taking up ceramics, lots of clay production, textiles, beadwork, and maybe I'm more attuned to it now than I've been before, but I feel like in the last the last number of years, it's been everywhere. Like you're not going to an exhibition now and not seeing clay works, where that wasn't the case before. So I want to ask the panelists, and I know Zoom is not the best format for conversation because it's hard to do what we naturally do, which is talk over one another, interject, and then pass from one to the next. But I'll ask why you think now there's been an interest from both artists and audiences to reinvest in craft and craft practices.
Well, I can start maybe. I think one of the things that I think people are looking for or seeking is that sense of being present and understanding how we're present. And because craft practices takes us into that embodied process of focusing on skill perhaps, or focusing on what's happening when I'm pushing this thing, or what do I feel from this moisture, or being aware of all those things kind of bring us to a here and nowness that I think has been really, really badly needed.
I think that, for instance, with textiles, there's been an understanding of textiles in relationship to histories of abstraction, and how those histories of abstraction are not only within a European or North American context, but in a much wider, broader way, and where those influences are actually stemming from. So I think that is one way in which textiles have kind of come into the contemporary art making. I would say with my work and with wanting to work with block printers, is that the works that I'm presenting are, for me, a proposal of what do these things look like when you kind of mash it all together. And I also think that there's the revival or interest in craft by contemporary artists is also a kind of resistance to mass production and to something being made somewhere else. I think that has a lot of resonance and weight as to why we're kind of seeing that in
I'm going to pick up on something that Nicole said. If we look at maybe this year's Biennale in Venice, which is very crafty, I'd like to say that maybe it has more to do with the fact that I think the world is looking to the margins, and that craft has always been there, and people who are working in, these ways, whether it's, through paper or ceramics or, textile, that it's always been there, and it has been overlooked. And it's not that necessarily that people are making more of it. It's just that our focus is there, as a global community, right? And so that's why, the attention of, uh, feminists working, women artists from the 70s and 80s, and also artists working in the margins, or, artists who are, indigenous or, not white, right? And anyway, that's what I see. Yeah.
I think you're all right. I think I'm happy, Suzanne, that you framed that question in terms of sort of why craft, which I think is one that has really guided my thinking on this too. Like the craft theory of the late 90s and early 2000s is very preoccupied with conversations around what is craft and how do we articulate what it is and what it is not and who is doing it. And I think that question around why is the one that's in some ways more interesting. And the one I usually kind of ask alongside it is also, what is craft being asked to communicate? And I think we've kind of roughed out a list of things that craft is called upon to do in contemporary art right now, and whether that's to talk about materials and embodiment and sensuality, or whether that's to as part of the sort of rethinking of the canon as museums kind of reconcile with who's been included and who hasn't. And I'm like suddenly blanking on what Swapna said, but I also thought it was a good point. Sorry, but I think that's like, yeah, like it's this whole kind of collection of things that makes it interesting to use now. And also I think has always been interesting to use. Like I think this, when we talk about the craft revival in the current moment, I think we've seen that moment at other times in history as well. And I always want to make sure to not talk about it as though it's new or unique, because there have been artists working at that intersection and in these kinds of cross purposes for a while. Oh yeah, like the political aspect too, like what craft can communicate about politics, I think is really important to people now too. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's a sense of also immediacy with craft, but also Nadia, what you were saying is that there's the, which I loved, like the quiet thinking hands of craft as well. And so the laboring on and thinking through what it is that you're doing, and Swapna too, like the material knowledge, and also Linda, what you said too is about local clay and the understanding where your materials are coming from are also a big part of production right now, in cultural production, and why it is that we're making the things that we're making and how we're making them through climate justice reform and thinking through why something needs to be made or how it's made or where it's made and where it's going afterwards as well. I think that there's a large cycle of materials that get discarded there afterwards. So my next question would be institutionally, because craft artists have been excluded from contemporary public galleries, and now that the language of craft is being included within these major exhibitions, it's like, do galleries really need to rethink and reevaluate their relationship with traditional craft artists?
I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here and say it depends which galleries, right? I mean, yeah, and this kind of goes back to what I said earlier about the power of the artist, right? And the talent of the artist and where that talent lies, and whether it's in, this kind of like super engagement of making, or in, this ability to communicate really clear ideas, and that those ideas kind of like, actually the ideas take on the art more than the actual art. And sometimes what happens is that those two things actually combine and you have really great art. But it's rare. It's not all the time. So, it depends on the gallery, and for sure, or the exhibition venue, and for sure, I think that there could be some interesting work to look back and to kind of like, re-examine that. But question mark. That's not my job.
Maybe I'd jump in there and say that maybe to return a bit to what I already said, but I think like a lot of museums are already doing this work, having just come from an institution with a collection where the collection sort of becomes the driving force, or becomes the sort of baggage that the institution is dealing with, that as museums are sort of looking at what they have and why they have it. Like, we might also bring in conversations around repatriation, or deaccessioning, or what objects do or do not belong in certain museums, or stolen objects as well could be part of that conversation. I think craft certainly has a place to play in that dialogue. I think there's the part too where I feel that sometimes in museums or in galleries, in contemporary galleries, there's just this lack of understanding about materials sometimes, or about, like I'm talking about, that historical material baggage. Or there's a piece too where I think because that sometimes the traditional craft practices have not, people don't know about them, or don't know the history, or don't know the material, that there are gaps in institutional knowledge sometimes that that I think would be cool to see filled more, or to have more of that, not only in institutions but also taught in art history classes. Or like, I think that bigger project of including and tending to craft dialogues can fall sort of across not only galleries but also universities, and all kinds of spaces.
Or Nicole, it's like a rethinking of material culture, and in that kind of yeah, I guess like just re-educating ourselves and viewers in these sort of institutional settings, because that's actually the contemporary work in a way, is being able to create links between objects and actually complicate their histories, and like why something was collected, why something from Japan in a German collection suddenly, what is it doing there? Like that giant collection of in Dresden of Chinese porcelain, like what are all those objects? Is it just are they just decoration? But all that skill, like, yeah, so maybe it's less about just institutions, suddenly, I don't know, it's a process of the re-education, but also there is something to be said for, like, I think a craft guild or like the crafts council and the galleries. I mean, I do also love seeing a really complicated piece of glass blowing, and I think that sorry, I'm totally like losing my words at the end of my day. I think that those also hold their own space, and as do contemporary art galleries. And Nadia, what you're saying is right. Like, when those things come together, it is very rare and it's very beautiful and very strong. Where I love this kind of distinction, or the melding of the mastery of making and the mastery of the idea. I think that's really a fascinating way of thinking about it. Yeah.
I agree with everything that's being said, and I think that it's really important to give a full range of acknowledging the power structures, the hierarchies in the process, and then opening up spaces and doing the homework to know what's happening in the very different places where craft dialogue is happening. So if it's happening in traditional crafts or at a guild setting or in a community that could be foregrounded more, I think that having each community, each artist and individual being able to voice that story around their work and to contextualize it so it's not institutionalized. I think one of the pitfalls of curatorial approaches in this endeavor is to then institutionalize everyone and try to have a seamless story happen, and in that retelling lose the burrs and the accents and the dialects and all of the individuation that happens through. I mean, each of us is touching material with our hands. It's so different each time. So if that could be extended into the language and the storytelling around it and put the power into the hands of the makers, that would be, I think, a huge move.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Linda. Institutions have a tendency to flatten so much. I also wanted to start to bring up some of the questions from the chat as it's getting busy. And Ria asked, Linda, I keep thinking about the uncanny, the serendipitous, the amazing connections you made with finding between your relationship with the acts of making and with language. Are there any particular processes or research methods through which you investigate this relationship?
I think one thing I try to do is to put myself in situations where my way of speaking or shaping language isn't the dominant one. And so I often find myself in Thailand or Indonesia or the Netherlands where I can't communicate without starting to dig into language, not only the language of the people and through voices, but also through how we make. So in each of the places, there's a different way to find clay and a different way to access fire and kilns, and all of these ways of kind of decentering our own comfort zone and to putting ourselves into this learning mode. I think that's kind of how I've approached it. So I'm not the expert, and I really value that process of making with other people's hands as well. So, you know, talking with people, but also making alongside other people, I think has been really, really important in order to find those intersections. There has to be lots of just kind of blurting and misspeaking. And there's not a lot of dignity in that sometimes, but I think it's necessary for my process.
And there's another question here too from Akhil, who asks how everybody positions themselves, whether or not you think about yourself as a crafts person, or whether or not you think about yourself as an artist, a philosopher, more of a brand is the word that's used. But is there any humility in craft that's outside of contemporary art production?
That's a really good question to chew on. I think of myself as a maker and a doer. But I don't have an expertise. So in that, I might think that I kind of fall outside, you know, someone who can craft, like I can make things, and sometimes I can make things well, but I'm not necessarily an expert on, you know, on any of the things that I make. So I don't know what that makes me. And I mean, in terms of humility, I think I'm often up against like the humility of the materials that I'm trying to work with and trying to work through and trying to test my ideas in. And, you know, I'm having these ideas right now, and I'm working with this material in particular, and it's not necessarily, it has its own life, and it's behaving in how it wants to behave. And so my idea doesn't necessarily sit within it. And so there's a humility in learning about that, which maybe most artists don't consider. Like, I might say that. I might start with that. Yeah. I might say more later.
This might sound really silly, and I don't mean it to sound as obnoxious as it probably would sound, but I do think of myself as an artisan in some way. But it's not to say that I'm an artisan like the artisans that I work with. I think that's not the same comparison. And I think of myself as a drawer, but I think the word artist is part of the process of like problematizing what all of these kind of structures mean, even like what craft means in a wider way for me, and wanting to sort of break down all of those divisions. But yeah, I mean, you know, again, I go back to having everyone present in the exhibition at ROM, and to have us considered as artists altogether is really interesting. Just even having them in the room with the work is interesting. But I'm not an artisan like them, and that would be that's a stretch. But I kind of like that idea of, I mean, what you're saying, Nadia, in terms of being a maker. It, you know, the doer, the maker, the working through a problem, the repetition of a task, all of those things, the kind of planning of that repetition. I actually, Nadia, I think of one of your schematics for one of your weavings. I think about it daily because it's so detailed, the one that you had on the back of the door. And I love the kind of like directional of this really complicated work that requires a lot of planning and a lot of concept also. So there is the, you know, the mastery of the idea is very much present in that. But then there's the mastery of the maker when you actually are going to then achieve this very complicated piece.
Yeah, and that idea production is not outside of craft, it's inherent in it as well.
I love how Nadia was talking about learning how to build things in an ancestral way, and how Swapna talked about decolonizing processes of image making. Like that, those hold so much meaning for me, and I think that that's what, you know, kind of propelled me to learn skill and to search in that way, in a way that is so deeply invested in that relationship with material and with history and with kind of intuitive knowing as well, but then trusting that to be part of a longer dialogue, a longer conversation that went before our lifetimes. I think that that's really meaningful. At the same time, in all of the amazing craft training that I've done, and I went to a school of craft and design, I think at every step of the learning, even though I've invested over 20 years in that kind of hand making, I've also resisted getting really good, really skilled. So that sense of unbuilding my forms, I think, kind of bars me from calling myself a craftsperson or an artisan, because I honor those terms and I've been trained in those traditions, and I've tried to, you know, to work towards that. But the constant tendency to unravel those things, I think, makes me just consider myself just the kind of flat artist.
I don't know if I should answer this one. I feel like it was less, but I would maybe say that I do, when I introduce myself as a critic or curator or art historian or researcher, I will often mention that one of my specializations is craft, and I usually do that pretty intentionally. And I think maybe it is a piece about humility too, or positioning sort of where I sit, knowing full well that sometimes that means that people don't take me as seriously. Like I do it almost on purpose sometimes. Like Linda, when I switched from sculpture into ceramics, I got a lot of flack from some of my, from actually less from profs and more from fellow students. Like, what are you doing? And I think some of that baggage has been a part of my career trajectory, and I kind of want to honor it a bit, and I want to continue to claim it and continue to, so I don't put it like, if I used to try and call myself a craft theorist, and I think I operate in that way sometimes, but more now I'll be like, I specialize, or I know about this thing, but I do it in a gesture towards kind of making space for it, but also almost on purpose, sort of seeing what people will do with that as a provocation sometimes.
I really love that, Nicole, and it reminds me of a moment in my career when many years ago when I was working on the SCAR project and trying to get funding from the arts councils, and it was impossible to get funding. And so there is something really true about this kind of like division in the perception of our peers. And part of it is that it's not sexy. It's not colorful, it doesn't, because all of you have like looked at images, right, and been on the other side of those peer evaluations in some way, and you have just a tiny bit of time, a fraction of time, to kind of like assess the quality of a work, and most of it, you're looking at size, you're looking at color, and you're looking at complexity. And so when you have a work like the SCAR project where, non-skilled or some skilled or, varying skilled hands come and make some sort of an intervention on a piece of raw canvas with, threads that are in different sizes, but mostly in a same kind of similar color palette, it just, it's hard to fund. Put that back on the institution there. There was some truth.
And Linda, you had talked about like intuitive knowing as well. There's a question from Magdalene where she asks, I'm wondering about the possibility that this drive towards craft as embodied making is a means of retreating from or rebuffing the increasingly disembodied experiences that we've been living.
I do think that is a motivation for sure. I think that it's changed though for me. Like I actually, went towards the material because I was stuck in front of a computer 8 hours a day, and I wanted to like not be in that physical position, and I wanted to be, sweaty and dirty, and I wanted to, start to understand things through my body and to learn things through my body in that way. But over the years, I think that, I've also started to see digital technology as this way of also, it's a craft too to me. I don't see it as not, so I don't see it as diametrically opposed at all. So I see the glitches of video and sound and those scraps as just as full of possibility, and a way to fertilize a practice that would otherwise not have this kind of material that would kind of spur it on to do something else or to misbehave. I think that the potential for misbehavior, maybe craft learning has taught me that over the years. I see that in everything now, so I don't really kind of have a binary for those. Because the disembodied life that we have on screen, it's kind of embodied in a different way, right? Like sometimes I sit on a ball that bounces. Sometimes, like we try to, you know, the haptics that happen through the materials. I think it's just maybe I'm so far in now, like through this Zoom experience, this many couple years of Zoom experience, that I'm just like finding another way to be physical.
Yeah, I feel like that idea is beautiful, but it's also really problematic. You know, I feel like it kind of, maybe it's true, but at the same time, I think that there's a lot of romanticization that goes on in, you know, this idea of the embodied practice, because really, I, I think there's all sorts of embodiment going on in practice, right? Because you're sitting with your, you know, even if you're painting. So, you know, I think of Hannah Wilke as doing an embodied practice, for instance. And so it's romantic, but I don't know. I'm not going to say yes. I want to resist that. I want to resist that.
I would maybe jump in too and refer people to an exhibition called In the Making that was curated by Diana Sherlock for the Illingworth Kerr Gallery a few years ago. It toured to the Kenderdine as well, that looked exactly at these intersections of craft and emerging technologies to trouble exactly this thing, this idea that craft and technology are opposed, but rather to think about how they intersect or inform one another, and to unpack those kinds of yeah, like that it needs to be a binary, or that they need to be in opposition to one another, when in fact, you know, a lot of craft processes are technologies, rely on technology, yeah, and come from similar gestures or places or desires of wanting to make things and make things well. Like those inspirations are common across a lot of practices, as Nadia was saying.
And absolutely, like, you know, I've been starting to work with an Oculus for, you know, some of the design work, and that is the most embodied practice that I can think of as a sculptor, because you're sitting in the digital moment with your piece, and you can feel its real size, you know, in a way that you couldn't with your imagination. So yeah, I think it's very exciting times, but anyway, but there is something about the quietness of, you know, maybe a beating practice, or when you're physically kind of exhausting from repetition, that is different. But I think you do that in all art, actually, you know, whether it's drawing or painting or sculpting, or I think it's inherent in the making.
And embodied experience isn't always positive, you know, like when I'm in the Oculus I feel so nauseated, but that's part of like the instability, like learning like another space. um, so it's not always like embodied experience equals positive experience. It's also discovering something else through discomfort.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight and for talking through, as Linda said, the messy, misbehaving nature of craft and clay and art, and through what it is that we're all discussing on a regular basis. I also want to say that we have an upcoming one with craft and its ability to subvert. It's designed by editor-in-chief Nihal Hadidi from the Studio Magazine, with artists and writers Azza El Sadiq, Erica Cardwell, and Anthea Black, and that will be in the fall. So thank you so much for, as we've done across like power outages, time zones, heat waves, and busy schedules. I thank you all for being here.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone.
thanks for having us. And thanks for having
Just-
me. Go ahead.
There's so many good questions that are kind of coming in, and yeah, questions about like research and creation and pedagogy and all of these things. I think that just to I think it's all part of the practice and what each of us are all doing, and us, I mean by everyone who's talking today and everyone who's attending. You know, I think that's all part of the practice. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to have the last word. Suzanne, you can wrap up.
Oh, I have a quick question before we all go away. Suzanne or Jasmine, will someone download the chat and the questions? I thought some of those were really nice, and I might want to look at them later.
We will.
Before we turn off this Zoom machine. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I just
Thanks so
wanted to
much.
say I had a really lovely, wonderful conversation with you all. So thank you so much. And thank you for your questions and your thoughts. And yeah, I look forward to next time. Thank you.
Yeah. It was so nice to see all of your work too, I have to say. I didn't get to, that was just like a real treat to see images.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I hope there's more conversations. Those questions are great. It's great to meet all of you.